Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I hope you're doing great. I'm doing fabulous, thank you very much, and I'm so glad you've joined me for part 3 of our story tonight. It's getting incredibly exciting, and we're about to discover whether Prim is going to accept $300,000 in exchange for having a body buried on her land, and she's in financial straits, so it's a very tempting offer. And if you haven't heard part 1 or part 2 of the story, make sure you click on the description. So let's continue with our story. It would mean she would not have to sell the beloved Painted Lady, the treasured farmhouse left to her by her great-uncle Walter, that had been remortgaged to pay off some of their outstanding debts. It would not have to be sold, and the $300,000 in cash would really make a huge difference to their lives. But would they be doing something morally wrong by allowing a dead body to be buried on their land? That is, of course, if the enigmatic, mysterious phone call was not actually a hoax, and that the caller was not getting his kicks with a filiginous crank call. But it seemed unlikely. Prank calls were never like this. Back in her mother's day, such phone calls were not actually uncommon. Prim wondered what to make of the paradoxical call. It did occur to her that maybe some clandestine market research was being done to see who would accept such an offer, whether over the past decade people's standards had slipped exponentially. She couldn't wait for Big Bear to return home, to discuss the inscrutable, rather baffling situation with him. What would he make of it? She was consumed with thoughts about $300,000 in cash that they could potentially acquire. She was so caught up and confounded by everything, she almost forgot about her bizarre, rather ambiguous encounter with a male Bigfoot that seemed rather like a fictitious page in a children's novel that she'd read to one of her children than something that had actually happened in real life. The events of the day had been so dreamlike, so profound, it was hard to believe they had actually happened. When Big Bear finally came staggering through the door like a great tsunami, Prim almost jumped out of her skin. Why was it whenever her husband returned home, everything rattled and quaked, as her large husband was not a small man, and even the floorboards groaned and grumbled under his heavy gait? "What is all this about?" he asked Prim, entering the kitchen. "What's so important I needed to leave work early?" "Sit down," said Prim, gesturing for her husband to take a chair at the kitchen table, with a firm, no-nonsense push of her hand. Big Bear was staring at Prim, with a worried, rather questionable look in his eyes. "Please don't tell me. We didn't have a debt collector at our door today, did we?" "Nothing like that," said Prim. Big Bear breathed out a huge sigh of relief. "You scared the hell out of me, Prim, saying I needed to get back here urgently. I thought someone had been at our house to collect our valuables, to pay off some of our debts. I was trembling all the way home." "I'm so sorry, Big Bear. I didn't mean to put you through that mental agony," she said, giving her husband a big hug. "But something so bizarre happened to me. I don't exactly know how to explain it to you. I don't know if it's good or bad." She was almost jiggling on her legs as she spoke, doing a half-hearted dance. Big Bear looked perplexed by his wife's incongruous body language that he couldn't read. He rubbed his chin reflectively. "Go on, spit it out, Prim. What exactly happened?" "I got a phone call this morning at lunchtime. The caller told me if they could bury a body on our land, no questions asked, he'd give me $3,000 in cash notes if we agreed to this business proposition. He knew we lived at the Painted Lady. The caller sounded deadly serious, abrupt, businesslike, if you know what I mean. I don't believe it was a hoax call, but of course you can never ever be certain. The caller is going to phone me back at 11 tomorrow, and if I don't answer the call, he'll know I'm not interested in the proposition, and will likely go elsewhere with some similar proposal with someone else, I imagine. If I do answer, he'll tell us how to proceed from thenceforth." Big Bear looked absolutely astounded. His eyes grew as round as saucers. He let out a loud whistle. $300,000, he said. "Are you sure he said $300,000? I'm sure. That's exactly what this person offered us, to bury a body on our land.
That is incredible. Absolutely incredible.
Big Bear threw his hand onto his face, rubbing his eyes vigorously, as if he wasn't sure his wife's revelations could be true. It is incredible, isn't it? Said Prim. Unless, of course, it's a hoax, and not a genuine call. But I think it was real. I could even sense the tension in the man's raspy voice. Of course we cannot agree to this, can we, Big Bear? We don't know who this dead body actually belongs to, and why this person would want us to allow them to bury a body on our land. Besides, it's not legal, is it? We could get into serious trouble if we were caught, allowing something like this to happen. Big Bear remained reflective, as if deep in thought. He continued to rub his chin, a self-soothing gesture he engaged in when he was collecting his thoughts together.
You will probably find the caller was from some kind of criminal organization, like the mafia or even a corrupted drug cartel of a kind, wanting to bury the body of an unethical individual on our premises, so he won't easily be found. It's a clever way to dispose of a corpse, is it not? My guess is they've probably done this kind of thing before. And there are people like us who've accepted such a proposition. I mean 300,000 smackaroons tax-free. It's like winning the lottery. Think about it, Prim. Why should we feel bad if an unscrupulous man of sorts is buried on our land? If you think about it, most of us don't know what lies buried beneath all the layers of soil on our property, beyond some of our deceased animals that we've buried over the years. The difference is if we agree to this business proposition, we will know all about it, and sometimes knowing something can be difficult to live with.
That's exactly my point, Big Bear. We'll know about that deceased corpse on our land. And you know it's not legal for us to agree to something like this, if we're being totally honest with ourselves.
Look, Prim, I'm going to be brutally blunt with you. I think we should accept this money, if in fact it is not a hoax. It's a huge amount of cash. Turning it away is like looking a gift horse in the mouth and saying no thanks. If we don't accept this proposition, we will almost certainly lose the painted lady.
But I thought you said we'd think of something, and that we wouldn't have to sell her.
Correction, said Big Bear. I said I was sure something would come up, and something has come up. Almost as if the universe herself has gifted us, as if she's heard our cries. We cannot afford to turn this away, Prim. That would be absolute madness. I don't care how unethical or ethical it is. Sometimes a man's got to do what a man's got to do. $300,000, Prim. It's a hell of a lot of money. We can pay off some of our mortgage, along with those medical debts. And I can give my parents $50,000 in cash. They could well do with the money. My father was saying sometimes you have to keep swimming to stay afloat. You've got to ride, or rather sail, the currents of life with a positive attitude. But by the sounds of things, my poor parents have been doing that for way too long. They deserve a break from their financial issues. Sometimes I wish we lived in a more gentle world, where money was not such a huge issue for everyone. But it is what it is. I mean, we wouldn't be in this messy pickle, would we, if medical costs were not so excruciatingly crippling? If anyone is unethical here, and criminal, it's these organizations charging us such excessively steep rates for Medicare.
Prim looked at Big Bear in astonishment. Why would you want to do that? Give your parents $50,000, I mean. I was under the impression they were well off. I mean, you went to private schools growing up. You had everything that money could buy. I thought your parents were rich.
No, they're not, Prim. I went to them to ask for a loan to help us pay off our medical debts, and they couldn't help me.
Why would you do that? Asked Prim aghast. Don't you know you never borrow money from family? It's a big, big mistake. There's too much to lose. Relationships can be soured.
Appearances can be very deceptive, Prim. Just because you think someone is well off, or because they're well-spoken, articulate, and present themselves well, does not mean they are. I had to learn the hard lesson that way. It was a kick in the guts, let me tell you. My parents are proud people. They'd never dream of asking anyone for help, even if they were eating their last loaf of bread. That's what they're like. Big Bear raised a hand. Yes, you're mad at me, I'm sure, Prim. Because you're proud, and you don't like asking people for help. But I was desperate. I was desperate for the both of us, so I asked my parents for a loan. And that's how I discovered how badly off they were. And I feel quite dreadful about it.
Prim's face grew white with indignation. Big Bear, how could you do something like that behind my back? I thought I told you that we would never ever ask friends or family for a loan. We agreed we'd never do something like that. I feel so embarrassed, so ashamed.
I'm sorry to do this to you, Prim. I was desperate to get us out of our current chaos. And silly me, I thought my seemingly wealthy parents could help us, only to find they're in a tough place themselves. I know how much the Painted Lady means to you, Prim, but it's not good news, I'm afraid. Everything my parents own belongs to the bank. Once they die, the bank gets everything. It makes me sick to my stomach. If you think about it, our government is to blame for all of this, exploiting people with crazy taxes. My parents have worked hard all their lives, and to see them struggling like this is criminal. I'm sorry it is. I don't mean to get angry, but I am furious. Do you not see, Prim, that accepting this money is a great idea for the both of us? It'll save our lives from imploding. As I told you, it is important for me that we have a secure future ahead of us. I think we can turn a blind eye to a dead body being buried on our land. Don't you, Prim? We need to look at the bigger picture. Can you see us, for example, living in a tiny place in Spokane, where we can hear our neighbours quarrelling, and there is not enough room in the backyard to swing a baseball bat? What about Heathcliff? He loves his walks in the grove. He loves running around the countryside. And then there's Smudge to consider. He likes to go ratting in the barn. Do you want to take that away from our animals and from our children? I think not. And beyond anything else, Prim, you love the Painted Lady. You consider her part of the family. And there's not much you wouldn't do to save her.
Prim considered Big Bear's reasoning for a moment. You don't have to preach to the converted, Big Bear. Don't you think I've wrestled all over this over and over again in my head? The last thing I want to do is to move to a cheap dump in Spokane, with noisy neighbours, and, as you say, a miserably small backyard. But I kid you not, Big Bear, it doesn't leave me with a good feeling, thinking about a deceased corpse being buried on our land. I'm sorry, it doesn't. Are you sure the person was actually bad in life, and was in fact a member of a gang or something? We don't know that for sure, do we, Big Bear? There are no guarantees. You're saying all this to justify the dead body being buried on our land. But supposing you've got it horribly wrong, what about the deceased family's loved ones? They might be wondering where he or she is. They've had no closure if they don't know where the dead body is. And even if it is a bad man, you must not forget, Big Bear, criminals still have families, don't they? And even if it is a thug from a drug cartel being buried on our property, it doesn't make it right. We are in effect hiding an insidious crime. That kind of makes us guilty by association, does it not?
Don't go down that rabbit hole, Prim, asking all those awkward questions. We'll be going around and round in circles, saying what if this, what if that, what if the next thing. It'll drive us completely insane. We cannot torment ourselves like this. We need to brush it under the carpet. Forget about it. This corpse is dead. It's not going anywhere. It's not going to come back from the dead. The corpse would have ended up in a cemetery with a grave marker. Or their ashes would have been sprinkled somewhere beautiful, like Ben is sprinkling Violet's ashes over the Mediterranean when he goes on that cruise. We are not responsible for the death of this person, are we? Much like the dead animals that are buried on this land, the corpse is dead and is being laid to rest on a beautiful property, way better than being in an awful cemetery. And if it were me, I would be happy to be buried here.
I'm not sure, Big Bear, that I'm comfortable with a corpse being buried on our land. That's the problem. It'll feel adulterated in some way, as if the corpse has added an ugly energy to the place, if you know what I mean.
No, I don't know what you mean, Prim. You're overthinking things, said Big Bear tenderly, taking his wife into his loving arms and kissing her forehead. The question you're going to have to ask yourself, Prim, is, are you prepared to sail the Painted Lady? Are you willing to move away from this magnificent farmhouse that great Uncle Walter left you and move somewhere small in Spokane? Because that is what's going to happen, unless you can sagaciously think of some other way of conjuring up this kind of money out of fresh air. And miracles like this don't happen unless you suddenly remember a very wealthy uncle who had deep, deep pockets and is uncommonly generous with his money. And it's just not going to happen.
You're right, said Prim. Of course I know you're right, Big Bear. We are going to have to do this. We don't have a choice in the matter. We must accept this money, or we stand to lose everything. I don't resent spending all the money on my mother's medical bills. I really don't. And I would do it again in a heartbeat if I had to. But you know, the biggest tragedy of all, Big Bear, is I don't know if it made any difference, spending all that money on her. Indeed, we might have made her suffer more, prolonged her agony, so to speak. It's something I've thought about a lot.
You know what your problem is, Prim. I don't mean to be unkind or insensitive, but you do engage in far too much thinking. It's not good for you. It's not healthy. You need to let it go. It's water under the bridge now. Let's move on, shall we? Your mother is dead. The script has been written. It can't be unwritten. These outstanding bills need to be paid, and we've got to get on board with it, whether we like it or not. And I know it's not pleasant, but you won't regret it, sweetheart. I believe we are doing the right thing. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, shall we? Until we know that this business deal is a genuine proposition. There is the faint possibility it might be a hoax, or that the person that called you has had a change of mind.
When 11 o'clock came and went the following day, Prim was almost relieved when the cell phone failed to ring. She looked up at Big Bear through narrowing eyes. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. It must have been a hoax after all. Or perhaps the man's changed his mind. But in a way I'm kind of relieved. But just as she said that, her cell phone rang, and she answered it very gingerly, turning it on to speakerphone so Big Bear could listen in to the conversation. Her heart was doing somersaults in her chest, and with trembling fingers she answered the call and said, "Hello, Prim speaking. Can I help you?" She could hear a man's voice at the end of the phone.
"Mrs. Clayson, are you on board?"
"I'm on board," said Prim. "Yes, I'm on board."
"Very good, then. We will proceed as discussed with the matter in question. I would like you to be absent from your premises at 2 p.m. tomorrow, returning at 4. Then the job will be done. You will find your money in cash notes. It will be delivered to your address. Is that settled?"
"Yes, it's settled," said Prim, looking up at Big Bear, who was sticking his thumb up in the air. And when the phone call ended, she collapsed into his arms. "Are we doing the right thing?" she asked him again.
"Of course we are," said Big Bear. "No doubt about it in my mind. By tomorrow afternoon, we'll be able to pay off our medical debts and keep the Painted Lady. And what could be better than that?"
The following afternoon, at 2 p.m., Big Bear had taken his wife for a late afternoon lunch in town. to give their mystery caller time to bury the body on their land. It was rather unsettling to think that someone was out there on their property, burying a body, but Big Bear tried not to think of the ramifications of agreeing to doing something like this. He was certain life would go on as it had done before, and they'd never give this unfortunate episode another passing thought. Prim found herself tucking heartily into pancakes with gusto, covering them in a plethora of maple syrup and ice cream, as the promise of $300,000 had brought her appetite crashing right back. Big Bear smiled contentedly to himself to see his wife wiping away the rest of the syrup from her plate with her fork, smacking her lips appreciatively. She was wearing a large smile on her face, rubbing her stomach contentedly, unable to believe how much she'd actually ingested. "I'm bursting! I'm so full! I feel as if I'm about to pop! I've eaten so much! It was so incredibly good! I had a craving for something wickedly sweet. I was watching one of those eating competitions on YouTube, you know, the other day. It's astounding what some of those people can put away. I mean, you wouldn't stand a chance in hell, Big Bear, eating as much as they do, and you've got a huge appetite. There was this donut ball competition, and in only a few minutes the winner must have eaten about 279 donut balls. Can you imagine being able to do that? And he wasn't even remotely overweight. How is that possible?"
"Maybe they throw it all up afterwards," said Big Bear. "It's not a pretty thought, I know. But imagine what all that food does to your stomach. It can't be healthy. You have no idea, Prim, how good it is to see you finally eating again. I'm so happy about it."
"Me too," said Prim. "I don't want to think about what's happening back at our property as I speak. But I'm so glad, so relieved that I won't have to sell the Painted Lady. I love that place with all my heart. I'm sure Great Uncle Walter is dancing up in heaven for joy. And I think it would be so great to help your parents out with money. I mean, goodness gracious me, they're such a dignified couple. I'd never have guessed for a moment that they were going through financial hardship." Big Bear smiled at his wife, squeezing her hand.
"We made the right decision, sweetheart," he told her. "At long last, life will be able to return to normal, and we won't have to concern ourselves with any more debt. And the best news of all is when the children return home, you'll be able to take them shopping and buy them some of the things they've been asking for a long time that we've had to refuse them."
Prim smiled. "That'll be so good. I'll take them to a toy store. Let them choose exactly what they want. They'll be so thrilled." Big Bear could not wait to see the dark shadows that resided under his wife's eyes for far too long, finally disappearing, and when she regained weight, all the weight she'd lost over the last few months, it would be like having his relaxed, fun-loving wife back again. He couldn't wait for his 2 rambunctious children to return home from their grandparents. Their cheerful voices would fill the house with jubilant chatter, which would echo happily through the walls of the Painted Lady. Life would be so good. Big Bear had no way of knowing that accepting a dead corpse on their premises was likely to have a boomerang effect on their lives that he never saw coming. But ignorance can be bliss until it comes back to bite you. When Prim and her husband Big Bear returned home to the Painted Lady, after having both overindulged in pancakes, the glamorous pink house was stretched out languidly under the soft shadows of the late afternoon sun, looking as if she'd been sunning herself contentedly. She looked like a shimmering pearl in an oyster shell. The Painted Lady seemed to welcome them both back with open arms. The windows appeared to be winking at them in the light. She looked as undisturbed and serene as she had when they'd first left the premises. Had someone rarely been on their property while they were out digging a grave? It didn't seem so. There were no obvious tire tracks anywhere, not left on the driveway. They expected something to feel different, to see some sign that would enable them to know that their property had in some way been vandalized and disturbed by a gravedigger. But everything looked benign and benevolently much the same. The sky was a pretty cup of blue, with slippers of yellow light painting themselves resplendently across the horizon in an unabashful golden glaze, as if someone had spilled orange paint across the sky. It was a sure sign that the sun was being magnanimously invited to set, and like a skilled artist, encouraged to splash some tangerine showers all over the firmament, to announce the end of the day. The couple could hear the ebullient barking of Heathcliff coming from the house, so Big Bear opened the front door to let the spirited dog out. He bounded out of the door like a buoyant tsunami wave, throwing himself at them, as if he hadn't seen them in half a century. "Down, boy," said Big Bear, laughing. "Down, boy. Yes, we're pleased to see you, Heathcliff. We really are. It's good to be back. But I think 500 slobbery kisses is more than enough for me in one day." Big Bear turned around to Prim. "We're both wearing jeans and sneakers. How about we quickly walk around the premises? See if we can see any sign where the body might have been buried." Heathcliff, after hearing the word walk, began to jump up and down like a big black hairy yo-yo. He was delighted that his owners appeared to be going for a walk late in the afternoon, and thought it might just be his lucky day, perhaps his birthday. He began zestfully tearing across the open field. "I don't see any sign of the ground having been disturbed," said Big Bear, as they walked across the open field, their eyes skimming over the naked bald patches in between the grass, that might have even been suspiciously lifted and replaced. "Look at this," said Big Bear, studying a muddy footprint in a bald patch in between the grass. "Have you ever?" he said, gasping in astonishment. "This footprint is about 6 times the size of mine, without exaggeration." Sure enough, as Prim peered over the ground to examine the footprint, she knew at once who the footprint belonged to. It even affirmed to her that the Bigfoot she'd seen the other day had not been a figment of her imagination. Big Bear eagerly leaned over the footprint, snapping pictures of it, placing his foot next to the footprint in the ground, by way of comparison. He looked quite flustered, his skin growing pink. "I think, Prim, there might have been a Bigfoot on our land," he told her. "I never believed in those things. But how do you explain such a large footprint? Look at that human toe. This is not the print of a bear." "A Bigfoot," said Prim. "How extraordinary!" She was unable to bring herself to tell Big Bear about the Bigfoot she'd seen, looking at her through the kitchen window, and how massive this creature had been. He had seemed so benevolent, and had spoken to her in her head, and assured her that all would be well. I mean, the idea seemed nonsensical and crazy, like something you might read in a fictitious fairy tale. But Prim knew that the Bigfoot had spoken to her telepathically, but it sounded far too unbelievable to share with her husband. Would he even believe her account? "Let's go into the wood grove," said Big Bear. "The body might be buried among the trees there." Big Bear continued looking at the ground for any more signs of disturbance. Prim had experienced the overwhelming feeling that they were now being followed. She was sure she'd heard snapping of twigs, and that did not come from her own feet. She glanced briefly over her shoulders, her keen eyes skirting the trees. She was sure she'd seen the tall, lofty, ambiguous, dark silhouette of something peeking at her, but it had happened so quickly it could have been a trick of the light. She couldn't be sure. Prim was quick to doubt herself, but she couldn't shake off the ominous feeling that they were indeed being stalked. It's like knowing that there is a leaf dangling on the back of your hair, and you brush it away, but nothing appears to be there. But you know it's there. You feel it. She knew they were being followed, and furthermore she knew who it was that was following them. It had to be the Bigfoot. And given she knew the Bigfoot was benevolent, being followed by the creature didn't worry her too much. She wondered if her husband had noticed anything at all. She glanced at Big Bear, but he was completely oblivious to the fact that they were not alone. All of a sudden, an electrified Heathcliff ran to an open clearing in the woods and began frenziedly digging at the loosened soil with his paws. This exuberant, adrenalized behaviour he commonly exhibited when recovering an old bone he'd forgotten he'd buried and was eager to retrieve. Heathcliff was forever burying old bones and rediscovering them again, bringing them back to the house. They would stink to high heaven and were positively revolting, so Prim had to find a way to dispose of them without being seen by her clever dog. Big Bear and Prim looked at each other knowingly. They had found the burial spot of the mysterious corpse that had been buried on their land. It sent shivers of dread down Prim's spine. Perhaps searching for the location of where the body was buried had not been a clever idea after all. She dreaded to think that this was someone's loved one, potentially buried under the ground here, but she tried not to meditate on this discomposing thought, as it unabashedly prickled at her conscience, tugging at her guilt. Prim glanced towards the trees. A head peered out at her from behind a large trunk, and for a brief second her eyes met the dark, treacle-coloured eyes of the Bigfoot, and then, just like that, he was gone.
"What are you looking at?" asked Big Bear,
staring at his wife. "Oh, nothing," she said, shrugging nonchalantly. How could she tell Big Bear what she'd seen? This was not the time nor the place for such revelations. Besides, she didn't want to alarm her husband, whom already had far too much on his mind. "Oh, nothing. I just thought someone was watching us, that's all."
"Funny," said Big Bear. "You had a very peculiar expression on your face, Prim. You looked like you'd seen a ghost."
"Did I?" said Prim, letting out a mock laugh. Big Bear returned his attention to their dog, who was throwing the soil up haphazardly all around the place with his paws, barking excitedly.
"Heathcliff, enough," said Big Bear. "Stop digging, boy. Well done for finding the grave. Good work. Let's go back home, shall we, before it gets dark?"
Heathcliff gave them both a pitiful look. He was itching to dig up the ground and get to the strange scent, but he knew better than to disobey Big Bear's stern tone of voice, that he'd learnt from bitter experience needed to be obeyed at all times, or no doggy treats would mysteriously make their way into his bowl. It was as they returned to the Painted Lady that Big Bear suddenly noticed a large bag hanging from the lattice work on one side of the wall, where the rambling wild roses were climbing up the walls of the house in a shower of pretty white blooms. He walked over to the duffel bag, undoing the zipper, and sure enough, lying neatly in the bag was a great deal of money.
"Oh, my goodness, Prim! It's the money! It looks like it's all here! All $300,000, said Big Bear, smiling brightly. "Oh, my God, Prim! Do you know what this means? This is really happening for us. We get to keep the Painted Lady."
For a moment the couple danced outside the Painted Lady, as if they'd won the state lottery, and Prim felt as if a huge weight had lifted off her shoulders like a hot air balloon floating in the wind. She persuaded herself to believe that the body on the land was that of a very bad man who worked for a drug cartel, and thinking of the body in that light made her conscience feel a lot more clear. The pink house smiled at them as the sun finally slipped into its secret resting place, and the light of the day faded away as fast as it took to make a large yawn. And before long the couple returned into the Painted Lady, as if they'd been enveloped by a large, warm hug. So there we are. That is the end of part 3. Isn't it exciting? So we're going to find out what kind of boomerang effect it's going to have, accepting $300,000 in cash. And I'm sure most of us would love $300,000 in cash. I know I would. So let's see where this is going to lead. It's very exciting. So until next time, goodbye and good night.